I've always hated taking the subway late at night. There's something about those nearly empty train cars, the dim, flickering lights, and the eerie silence that makes my skin crawl. But I had no other choice. My shift at the small downtown diner ended at nearly midnight, and by the time I cleaned up, counted the register, and finally got out, the streets were mostly deserted. The subway was the only way home. That night, the air felt colder than usual as I descended the stairs into the underground station. The city had been hit by an unexpected cold front, and I could see my breath in the dimly lit tunnel. The few passengers waiting on the platform looked just as exhausted as I felt. A couple of them had their heads down, scrolling through their phones, while others leaned against the walls, looking half asleep. As I checked my own phone, a deep, metallic screech echoed down the tunnel, followed by the rhythmic clanking of wheels on steel tracks. I looked up just in time to see the subway train pulling in. The headlights cast long, shifting shadows across the platform, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement down the tunnel behind it, something shifting in the darkness. I shook off the feeling and stepped onto the train as the doors hissed open. The moment I entered the last car, I felt it. Something was wrong. The air inside was stale and freezing, much colder than the platform had been. The overhead lights flickered slightly, casting an eerie glow over the nearly empty seats. A woman in business attire sat near the front, dozing off against the window, her breath fogging up the glass. A man in a hoodie was hunched over his phone, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. And then, at the far end of the car, sat the old man. His appearance was strange. He wore an old-fashioned black suit, the kind that looked like it belonged in another era. His hands, thin and bony, rested stiffly on his lap. But the thing that unnerved me the most was his face. His skin was an unnatural shade of pale, almost gray, like a wax figure that had been left under dim lighting for too long. And his eyes were locked onto mine. The moment I stepped into the car, he didn't look away. He didn't blink. His gaze followed me as I walked down the aisle, the weight of his stare pressing into my back. My instinct screamed at me to sit as far away as possible, so I dropped into a seat near the middle, making sure to keep a few rows between us. The train doors slid shut with a metallic hiss, and the subway lurched forward, its wheels screeching against the tracks. I exhaled sharply, telling myself I was just tired, that I was overthinking things. But when I glanced up at the window, I could see his reflection, and he was still watching me. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling aimlessly through messages and notifications, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every few moments, my eyes flickered back to the window, and every time, his eyes were still locked on me. The train rattled through station after station, and gradually, the other passengers got off. First, the woman at the front. Then, the guy with the phone. Soon, it was just me and the old man. I swallowed hard, gripping my bag tighter. Why wasn't he getting off? Another stop passed. The old man still didn't move. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breathing shallow. I forced myself to glance over at him directly, just for a second. He hadn't moved an inch. His hands still rested on his lap. His posture was still unnaturally stiff, and yet, his stare never wavered. The train entered a long, dark tunnel. The lights flickered, just for a moment. And in that moment, I heard movement. It was subtle. The sound of fabric shifting, a faint creak of a seat behind me. My body stiffened as I held my breath. The lights flickered back on, and I froze. The old man was gone. I whipped my head around, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one there. The seat where he had been sitting was completely empty. My eyes darted up and down the car. No movement, no sound, just me. The train rumbled through the tunnel, the overhead lights humming softly. The air felt heavier, like the pressure had changed, like something was looming just behind me. Then the lights flickered again, and this time I heard breathing. It was slow, ragged, right behind me. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My muscles locked up, my fingers clenching the edge of my seat. The breathing grew louder, closer. I could feel cold air on the back of my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut, whispering to myself, "It's not real. It's not real." The lights flickered back on, and the breathing stopped. I opened my eyes and turned my head slightly, my heart hammering. There was nothing behind me, just the empty rows of seats. I didn't hesitate. I shot up from my seat, bolting toward the doors before the train even reached the next station. My hands trembled as I grabbed the metal pole for support, my knees threatening to buckle beneath me. As the train slowed down, I glanced toward the far end of the car, and my stomach dropped. The old man was back, sitting in the exact same seat, his hands folded neatly in his lap. But something was different now. He was smiling. A slow, unnatural grin stretched across his face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too white. The train doors slid open, and I ran. I didn't care who saw me. I sprinted up the stairs 2 at a time, bursting out onto the cold city streets, gasping for air. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, my lungs burning, my heart pounding like a war drum. I never took that train again. But sometimes, late at night, when I pass by that subway station, I feel it, that same heavy, watchful stare. And I wonder if he's still there, sitting in that last car, waiting for the next unlucky passenger. I never believed in ghosts. I grew up hearing stories about haunted train tracks and phantom passengers, but they always felt like just that, stories. That all changed the night I took the last train home. It was a cold November night, and I had stayed late at work, trying to finish a big project. By the time I left the office, it was past midnight. The streets were nearly deserted, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows across the pavement. I hurried toward the station, my breath visible in the frigid air. The underground station was emptier than usual. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, giving the tiled floors a sickly yellow tint. I pulled my coat tighter around myself as I walked to the platform, my footsteps echoing against the cold concrete. When I reached the platform, the place was practically empty. Only a handful of people stood around, most of them looking just as tired as I felt. A few commuters scrolled through their phones, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. The air was thick with silence, interrupted only by the distant rumbling of an approaching train. As the train pulled in, something felt off. The exterior looked normal, silver metal reflecting the dim station lights. But when the doors slid open, I hesitated. The inside of the car was strangely dim, the overhead lights flickering every few seconds. The seats were mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, all of whom sat eerily still. I shook off my unease and stepped inside. The doors shut behind me with a heavy, echoing clang. As I walked down the aisle, I noticed something odd. The passengers, they weren't moving. At first, I thought they were just asleep, their heads tilted downward, hands resting on their laps. But as I passed them, I realized they weren't even breathing. Their chests didn't rise or fall. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes hidden beneath the brims of their hats or the shadows cast by the flickering lights. A chill crawled up my spine, but I forced myself to sit down. It had been a long day. I was probably imagining things. The train shuddered forward, the metal wheels screeching against the tracks. I exhaled and leaned my head against the window, watching the dark tunnels blur past. But as I settled in, I felt it. A presence, like someone was watching me. Slowly, I turned my head and nearly jumped out of my seat. A conductor stood in the aisle, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform. His navy blue coat was buttoned all the way up, a brass badge pinned to his chest that read, "Station Master." A neatly pressed hat sat atop his head, casting a shadow over his pale face. But his eyes were hollow, deep sunken pits that seemed to stretch into darkness. His lips barely moved as he spoke, his voice low and hollow. "You shouldn't be here." I swallowed hard. "What?" "You need to get off this train." My pulse quickened. "Why?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, his black-gloved hands tightening at his sides. I looked around, expecting the other passengers to react. But they didn't move. They sat frozen, their bodies eerily stiff, their faces completely blank. My stomach twisted. Something was very wrong. The conductor's voice grew colder. "Next stop. Get off." The train rattled violently, the lights flickering even more erratically. The air grew thick, almost suffocating. I could hear something, a faint, whispering sound, like distant voices. Then I saw it. Outside the window, the tracks were disappearing. One by one, the wooden planks and steel rails seemed to dissolve into darkness. An endless void swallowed the path ahead, creeping closer, consuming everything in its way. Panic surged through me. The train wasn't slowing down. It was heading straight into nothingness. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. The conductor simply pointed toward the doors, his expression unreadable. "Next stop," he repeated. "Last chance." The train screeched as it approached a station. Without thinking, I ran for the door, slamming my palm against the emergency release button. The doors didn't open. I turned to the conductor, desperation in my voice. "Please!" Before I could finish, he reached up and pulled a lever above his head. The doors hissed open. I didn't hesitate. I jumped. The moment my feet hit the platform, the train vanished. Not just down the tunnel. It was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. The station was empty. No passengers. No signs of the train that had just dropped me off. I turned toward the exit, my mind reeling. As I stepped forward, I noticed something near the tracks. A rusted old sign stood crookedly against the wall. My stomach dropped as I read the faded letters. Line closed. Terminal 6. Disaster of 1952. All passengers lost. My head spun. That was impossible. Terminal 6 had been shut down decades ago after a fatal derailment. The train had never been recovered. The bodies of the passengers were never found. And then I heard it. A distant, echoing voice. "Next stop, last chance." I didn't look back. I ran. I've been a freight train operator for nearly 2 decades. I know these tracks like the back of my hand. Their turns, their dips, their tunnels, their crossings. I can practically navigate them with my eyes closed. But one night, a new tunnel appeared. A tunnel that wasn't supposed to be there. It was a late autumn night, and the sky was an endless stretch of black. The moon was barely visible, and the mist curled around the tracks like ghostly fingers. My train, loaded with cargo, was on its usual route, a trip I had taken countless times before. The hum of the wheels against the steel rails was hypnotic, and the occasional flickering of the signal lights along the track was the only movement in the stillness of the night. It was around 3 a.m. when I noticed something strange. I was nearing mile marker 237, an area I knew well. Normally past this point, the land stretched out flat, open fields on either side, nothing but darkness and an occasional lone tree. There were no tunnels, no bridges, nothing but endless rails stretching toward the horizon. But as I looked ahead, a tunnel yawned open before me. I blinked hard. This wasn't right. I'd taken this route hundreds of times, and I knew for a fact that there was no tunnel here. My breath caught in my throat. Where did it come from? The entrance was massive, its stone archway old and crumbling, covered in dark vines. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for centuries. But I knew it hadn't. A cold chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my radio. "Dispatch, this is train 47. Do you read me?" Static. I adjusted the dial, trying again. "Dispatch, I need confirmation on my route. There's a tunnel here that shouldn't be." Static. Then, something worse. A faint whisper crackled through the radio. I gripped the controls tighter. My stomach churned as the train plunged forward, unable to stop in time. We entered the tunnel. The moment we crossed the threshold, everything changed. The air inside was heavy, suffocating. The temperature dropped instantly, my breath turning into thick white clouds. The headlights barely cut through the suffocating darkness, illuminating damp, glistening stone walls that seemed to breathe. I checked my GPS. Blank. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my nerves in check. But something wasn't right. The tunnel should have been short, maybe a few hundred feet at most. But the train kept going, and going, and going. I checked my watch again. 3:17 a.m. It hadn't changed. A growing sense of panic clawed at my chest. This wasn't normal. Time wasn't moving. Then something thumped against the roof of the train. I jolted upright, heart hammering. My hands went cold, and my fingers tightened around the throttle. Another thump. It wasn't just a sound. It was footsteps. Something was crawling on top of the train. I flicked the rearview camera on the dashboard. At first, the screen was nothing but static. Then, movement. A figure crawled across the top of one of the freight cars. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. The way it moved was unnatural, its body jerking as it crawled like an insect. My throat went dry as I watched it skitter toward the front of the train. The power flickered. The lights dimmed. The radio crackled to life. "Stop the train." The voice was barely more than a whisper, hoarse and distant, but it was urgent, desperate. I grabbed the receiver. "Who is this?" "Stop the train. Now." The static screamed in my ears. Then the voice came again, louder. "Stop now, or you won't get out." I barely had time to process the words before the lights went out completely. Total darkness swallowed me whole. I fumbled blindly for my flashlight, my heart pounding in my ears. The only sound was the train's wheels screeching against the rails, echoing endlessly. Then I saw it, a face pressed against the windshield. Pale, gaunt, mouth stretched too wide, eyes hollow and black. The breath left my lungs as the thing grinned at me. I slammed the emergency brake. The train lurched violently, sending cargo crashing and metal screeching. Sparks erupted as we skidded along the rails, the force nearly throwing me from my seat. The figure on the windshield disappeared, and then the walls began to move. Not walls. Hands. Hundreds. Thousands of hands, blackened and skeletal, crawling out from the stone. Their fingers scratched the windows, leaving deep, jagged gouges in the glass. They reached, desperate, pulling at the train, pulling at me. The shrieking noise filled the tunnel, a sound of pure agony. I threw the throttle into reverse. The train screamed backward, metal groaning as I yanked it out of the tunnel at full force. The walls of arms retreated into the shadows, melting away as if they were never there. The entrance loomed ahead, a sliver of night sky beyond. And then, I was out. The train rolled to a slow, shuddering stop. I gasped for breath, my entire body trembling. The air was normal again. The sky above was clear, the mist gone. I turned to look behind me. The tunnel was gone. Vanished. Nothing but empty tracks, stretching into the horizon, as they always had. My radio crackled. "Train 47, come in. We lost your signal for a while. Everything okay?" I hesitated, staring at the empty tracks. "Yeah," I muttered. "I think so." I didn't report what I saw. Who would believe me? But as I checked the last freight car, my blood ran cold. On the rusted metal, deep scratches formed 4 chilling words. "You shouldn't have stopped. Narpadaude." Trains have long been symbols of travel, progress, and connection. But as these stories have shown, they can also be the setting for unspeakable horrors, encounters that defy logic, reason, and even time itself. Whether it's an unexplained passenger, a ghostly conductor, or a tunnel that should never exist, the railway holds secrets that many wish to forget. What is it about trains that make them so terrifying? Maybe it's the isolation of a long journey through the dead of night, where the rhythmic clatter of the wheels can lull you into a false sense of security. Maybe it's the knowledge that once the doors close, you're trapped, sealed inside a moving steel cage with strangers, never knowing who, or what, might be sitting just a few rows behind you. Or perhaps it's the abandoned tracks, long overgrown, where echoes of past tragedies still linger, waiting for an unsuspecting traveler to stumble into something they were never meant to find. There are countless stories of haunted railways, phantom trains that appear only at night, and stations where passengers step off, only to find themselves in a place that doesn't exist. What if, somewhere out there, a train has been running for decades without ever stopping? A train that only takes passengers who never return. The next time you step onto a train, take a moment to listen. Do the tracks hum as they should? Are the lights flickering in a way they shouldn't? Do the reflections in the window move in sync with the passengers? Or is something just a little off? And if you ever find yourself alone in a train car at night, staring at your own reflection, make sure it doesn't blink when you don't. Because some passengers never really leave, and some trains, once boarded, never let you off. Thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay alert, and be careful where your train takes you. Train. Do you have your own terrifying train experience? Have you witnessed something strange while riding the subway or a midnight train? If so, we want to hear your story. Send us your scariest true horror stories, and they might be featured in a future episode.